Hey there, coaches and athletes. I'm Michael Hughes, functional movement specialist and CEO of Gymnazo EDU. Today I'm going to be breaking down tendonitis of this thing called the elbow. I'm going to talk about the 3 deeper root causes of tendonitis that aren't focused on the arms. I'm going to dive deep into the biomechanics of each one of these different segments, show you how to identify a cause, and then give you a few solutions that you can test out with your own clients and your own athletes. Before I get started though, please make sure to subscribe to our channel for more of our content where we focus on the root causes of movement and dysfunction and give you strategies on how to think, not just what to think. All right, so tendonitis of the elbow is a pretty common thing that I see with athletes, and it's gained its name from athletes who play golf and play tennis. But it can also show up when people are trying to grab just basic household things or just daily life activities. So what is a standard protocol for treating elbow tendonitis? Well, if you look back and look at all the research and all the things that are coming out in YouTube videos or anything that's been traditional treatment, it's rest it. Don't do that activity anymore. Maybe put some ice on it to calm down the localized inflammation or strengthen the direct area. And I look at all those possibilities of treatment and I'm like, which one of those actually talk about what's really going on? Because really, this is just the site of dysfunction. Think about it like this. You're living in a house. You have a drip from your ceiling. The problem is really the fact that you have a puddle on your floor. So if I just go grab a bucket, put it right there, am I saying, oh, my problem's fixed? Look at that. I rested it, I put some ice on it, and I just didn't step there anymore. Problem fixed. No way. You're like, no. You still got a hole in your ceiling. But if you know anything about houses and fluid dynamics of water, right, it follows the path of least resistance, physics, right? You know that there could be literally a hole on the other side of your roof, but the water is following the path of the rafters and the beams and the 2x4s because it's going downhill, the path of least resistance. Well, that's just basic physics, but we think of a problem always what we see. I don't blame people for doing that, but as a movement practitioner, of one who wants to be specialized in chain reaction biomechanics, we have to think about the deeper problem ahead of us, and that's what we're going to be doing in this video. So let's do a few definitions just to kind of be on the same page what we're talking about. Okay, the big picture. So the lateral epicondyle of the elbow is essentially tennis elbow. And that's because it's typically been felt on this type of motion pattern or backhand in tennis. The medial epicondyle of the elbow is typically called golfer's elbow, and that's because it's typically felt as you come through on a right-handed athlete, let me say, come through and pain. And typically those types of activities that are sporting activities, full body motion patterns, honestly the issue is with the full body. Even though the pain is here and here, it's typically with the full body, that's where we're going to help solve this problem, not treating the localized area. Is it bad to treat the localized area? It's not bad. It's just not going to give you the long-term effects that you were really looking for to superly solve the problem. However, there are localized issues as well. Like if it only hurts when you grip, like it only hurts here and here when you grip, then yes, it could be a localized problem. It could be just forearm, just upper arm, and treating those 2 areas with the protocol that's been out there, it can help. But again, we're looking at truly understanding where the root problem can totally come from. And in my experience, some of the other super common causes for elbow tendonitis have to do with the thoracic spine, have to do with the hips, and have to do with the ankles. So I'm going to break down what's going on biomechanically in each of these areas, how to identify whether it's a strengthening or lengthening issue, or a stability or mobility issue, and some example exercises that you can perform to help alleviate or eliminate the pain entirely. But let's kick it off with understanding what's going on with the thoracic spine. So if I'm in tennis, right, I'm speaking from a right-hander perspective. If I'm going in and I'm going through back into my loaded swing here to rally through that ball to hit, or even if I'm grabbing something in my house from across my body and grabbing it and bringing it across, what's going on? Well, from a localized standpoint, my shoulder, the next joint up, is going through horizontal adduction, which means it's coming across the midline of my body. My scapula is going through protraction. It's really reaching across and kind of sneaking around my rib cage. And what's happening is basically I got the tricep connective tissue, just to keep it very, very simple. I got my posterior deltoid. I have the back of my scapula muscles, I have my rhomboids, all lengthening through a range of motion. Now again, there's a lot more details there, but they're basically just going through a lengthening phase. And then from there, they need to power up and then basically shorten and then go through a power swing. Well, what happens when my arm comes right all the way across my body, I also get thoracic spine rotation. Fair enough. Okay, what about from the medial side? Let's call it golfer's elbow, right? Well, as I come through, again, on a right-hander, as I come through on my backswing, what am I getting? Well, from a localized standpoint, I'm also getting kind of a deeper aspect of the tricep, even some bicep, even though my arm's flexed a little bit, so mostly tricep, coming through. I'm getting through my front part of my anterior deltoid. I'm getting through my pec major and minor. I'm getting my humerus to go through essentially the opposite pattern that I just had. So I'm going to call it horizontal abduction, just to keep it simple. I'm also getting some basic relative lifting in it, so I got some other planes of motion going on. And I'm also getting my scapula to go through essentially the retraction phase. So I'm getting it pulled back and rolling across the rib cage. And then I'm also getting major thoracic spine rotation. Definitely plays into it. So how do I figure out if it's a strengthening or lengthening issue? Well, from a strengthening standpoint, I'm going to use this phrase over and over again. We want to see if the sequencing of power production is in appropriate syncing, right? We want to know, like, are they just hitting with their entire arm? Are they just going here and whacking it? Or are they actually feeding through their thoracic spine? So that's the first thing I want to see. If they're not doing that, then just start to teach better sequencing. If they are doing that, then we're going to want to start strengthening the muscles through the thoracic spine, and I'll touch that on a little bit later. So just think about it. Strengthening issue, can they sequence appropriately? Lengthening issue, well, I want to see if their thoracic spine, especially with lateral epicondylitis or tennis elbow, are they getting good thoracic spine rotation to the left? Through the left. Now again, this is for the right-handed tennis player or pain with the right or outside, right, on the lateral side. Because it's not always about tennis. In fact, you're going to see more clients who they don't have it with tennis in particular, just normal lifestyle. But can they get good thoracic spine rotation? And I test that by having them sit down. And even if you don't have anything to sit down on, even sitting down on the floor and crossing their arms across the body and say, can you rotate to the right and see how much thoracic spine rotation goes right and how much goes to the left? And you have to view that and see, are they stuck, limited, going to the left? And if they are, you're like, okay, sweet, I got something to work on, because they need to lengthen through that connective tissue to gain the appropriate power that they're not getting, and therefore it's sending a stress signal all the way down to the weakest point, or where the path of least resistance goes to. And that's how a typical understanding of a lengthening issue or mobility issue can lead to outside or lateral elbow pain. So what do I do about it? Well, we like to think about it from 3 different possible solutions. Now, not all of these are necessary, but it's certainly a stepping process to help you critically think about what's going on. So we're going to think about it from a soft tissue component, from a stretching component, and then from an exercising or strengthening component. Soft tissue, lengthening, strengthening. I'll say that again. Soft tissue, lengthening, strengthening. If you can follow those 3 different paths, understanding how the whole system works together, that's going to be a very helpful formula in a sense, not really a formula, but a way of thinking to allow you to accomplish a lot of problems with movement dysfunction. So what I would do, I would grab onto a foam roller, foam ball, and because I cannot rotate to the left very, very well, I'm going to have to think about, well, what side of my body is actually needing more lengthening? Well, it's actually going to be my right side, because I can't go to the left. What allows me to go left? My right side. So I would grab onto a ball, foam roller, on the ground, onto a wall, whatever the case is, and put that ball on that tissue and start to do some myofascial release to get me more unlocking of that connective tissue. Now, where are you going to go? Well, you're first going to go on the intercostals. So you're going to go on the latissimus dorsi, the lat. There's a bunch of other muscles in that relative zone, but the fascial chains of that area, and you want to lengthen them out. Now, if you want more information on how to foam roll appropriately, we have other videos on that as well, but let's just keep it at that for now. Now, from a stretching component, right, I want to be able to think about as I'm going through this pattern of rotation, there's two primary motions that I'm going through. I'm going through rotation. I'm also going through lateral flexion. You can see as this shoulder's lower than this shoulder. So what I want to do is maybe grab onto, if you have some sort of kind of holding on pattern, like all of you have stretching cages, which is totally fine, but you need something you can grab onto to pull you into left rotation and to start driving your pelvis in the opposite direction. Again, there's multiple ways how to stretch this. I'm just showing you one, and just driving through the body, holding on to that position to hopefully give myself more range of motion through my left side. Now you can hold that position and drive your pelvis forward and back, hold that position and drive your pelvis laterally. There's a lot of different techniques, but just more I want you to think about how to think about it. But I also want to think about rotation to the opposite. As I'm going rotation one way, I want to think about the lean to the opposite side. So as I'm formuling both my lateral trunks, I want to think about how do I stretch out that side as well. So I can reach over the top, slide away, spin away. Because as the rotation needs to come from my right side, the lateral flexion needs to come from my left side. So I start to think about how I can get that going. If you're not really sure how to think about that one, just get after both sides. Help them rotate one way, help them rotate the other way, help them get one side, help them get the opposite side, free up the thoracic spine any way that you possibly can, understanding that it's always going to feed, and we always want to train as much as we possibly can, the full person, not just the localized pain. Now, as we're going about strengthening, how do we bring more sequencing and power through that spot? Well, we like to think about it from two major techniques, even though there's many, is the fact of coiling. And coiling is a very fancy, cool word to think about. I'm going to draw my body to one side, lengthen through what I just did stretching, and then produce a lengthening, which produces a loading to the opposite side. So as I lengthen, I'm going to load through this side, and I'm going to explode out of it. So think about elbow to back pocket, other elbow, lift. And from there, I can start to think about that pattern of contracting through my lateral core, through my thoracic spine, versus through my arms. If you want to load that up a little bit, we can think about it in a different way. We call it type 1 or type 2 spine movement patterns, which I want to take my body and think about how am I going through that backswing exactly. Well, I'm reaching one way, and I'm essentially leaning the opposite, so if I load it up, I can power it through and lengthen, and then through my trunk, I'm driving through this part of my body. My arms are just holding on as they're basically just levers to create this huge whip through a racket or through anything that I'm just grabbing onto. The key is to get this to become more engaged and less gunky. Again, the techniques are pretty much limitless, but it's the understanding and the strategy that I want you to think about. It's a two-phase pattern. It's rotation and lateral flexion. There is also flexion and extension involved, but the first two on the frontal plane and the transverse plane are the primary two that should be focused on. Okay, so that's the thoracic spine as it relates to elbow tendonitis. A quick little check-in, okay? Are you a bit lost, or have you had a bit of an aha moment? Let me know where you're at in the comments below. All right, let's go into how the hips can play into the elbow. Now again, the process is relatively the same, so I'm going to go a little bit faster because you're going to understand the same outline that I'm going to be going through as a way of how to think, not just like here's an answer, here's an answer. So as I'm going into this same point, I'm going to go from the lateral, the top elbow first, as I'm coming from a right-hander, as I'm spinning my arm through my scapula, through my thoracic spine now, keeping all those things the same. As I rotate into it, what is happening at my left hip? As I'm coming back, grabbing and reaching or looking for a ball, I'm going through three distinct patterns in my left hip. I'm going through flexion in the sagittal plane. I'm going through adduction in the frontal plane. And I'm going through internal rotation in the transverse plane, which essentially hits two massive muscle groups, the entire glute structure, the posterior hip, and the lateral hamstrings. But I have two hips though. So what happens on this right side? Now let's say I'm still loaded through both feet. If I'm pivoting through, it changes the scenario a little bit, but what if I'm still planted? Well, as I'm basically going through extension in the sagittal plane, I'm going through abduction in the frontal plane, and I'm going through external rotation in the transverse plane. What does all that mean? The adductors are playing a huge part in allowing me to do that. The hip flexor is playing a part to do that. Even through the quadricep, it's allowing me to do that. What if those things are not? We'll talk about that. Okay, what about on the inside? Well, essentially, as I'm taking through the medial side, if I think more of a golfer's perspective, or if I'm reaching this way and coming across this way, it's the opposite. Just whatever I just said is happening now on the right hip for the left side, and whatever I just said is from the right side is now happening on the left side. So that's essentially just to keep it simple, right? It's the same mechanics, just reversed hips. All right, so how do I figure this out from a strengthening issue? Well, again, I'm going to go from this standpoint. Like, think about sequencing. Am I actually moving through the hips? Even if it's a small thing in a household, are my hips playing a part, or is it all upper body focused? Right? Thousands and thousands of repetitions, not playing full systems, start to chew on joints. So even in household drills, like, are they accessing the rotation or the motion patterns from the pelvis? So strengthening issues typically come from a lack of sequencing. Typically is the key word. What about lengthening? Well, those biomechanics that I just described are probably not happening. If it's coming from the hips, I'm not getting enough internal rotation or external rotation. I'm not getting enough adduction or abduction. I'm not getting enough flexion or extension at the relative joints that I just mentioned. So I need to go after those. So what did I talk about? Well, I talked about going after the posterior hip for coming across the body, or the medial hip to go after the other side. So again, let's say we want to approach it from a soft tissue point. Well, I'm going to get on the ground, ball, foam roller, whatever the case is, I'm going to go after my hip flexors. Not as my primary one, but certainly one if I need more extension coming through my opposite side. I'm going to go through my adductors. I'm going to make sure I can get all the soft tissue feeling like it has the availability to lengthen, therefore to strengthen. Balls right on this inside thigh. I'm also going to go through the glutes. No questions asked. I'm going to find a spot and I see, okay, do I have the myofascial capacity to even load and strengthen through the area? And I'm also going to go through the hamstrings. Again, just ways to think about this. Ways to think about, okay, is the connective tissue playing its appropriate role? Now again, how we foam roll is in a different video, but just ways for you guys to think about how to go about that. Okay, what are my stretching techniques? Well, there's a bunch of ways that we can stretch those same muscles. We can use, again, amazing pieces of equipment like this True Stretch, but honestly, most people don't have that. So let's just go on ground. So from an on ground perspective, I can make sure that I have enough hip range of motion. I'll go for my hip flexor. Make sure I have hip extension, but as appropriate to the motion pattern that I want. So I want hip extension with hip external rotation. Again, my knee is staying fixed, so as my pelvis moves away from it, I'm getting relative external rotation. And then from that, I can also drive in the frontal plane as well to get a little bit more hip flexor, but now play into the adductor. And from the adductor, I can also go through a rotational pattern. Again, there's other ways to stretch out the adductor. I can do it from a standing position, and I can really start to play into it. But again, I'll let the techniques be unlimited and for your own understanding to play through it as it fits to the person in front of you. What about the hamstrings? Well, from a kneeling standpoint, I can kick out, give myself some good stability. Now, because it's in my backswing, it's in my loading spot, I want to put that support on the same side so I can tuck in and really get the appropriate hamstrings because there's more than just one. So I want to play into that one. As for my glute, on the kneeling side, I can cross over, I can tilt into it, get a lot more hip flexion, get some good rotation to play into that hip right there. From a standing position, I can do the same thing, play into it again, cross over to get my same side very appropriately. Glute, I can do the same thing and load into it as I start to play and give that more of the triplane loading that it really, really wants. Okay, all right, Michael, so what about strengthening that area? How do I get really appropriate localized strengthening in the rotational or in these points? Well, certainly you can do squats and lunges and all those things like that all make sense, but I thought about getting a little bit more creative, a little bit more dialed in, a little bit more authentic to the motion pattern of what we think about batting, punching, kicking, throwing, running. So a great tool is out there called the torque strap, which is basically a way that you can think about it. Just a nice little loop of fabric, put it into one hip. There's a few different strategies to think about this one. I'm going to wrap it around, make sure it's around my pelvis securely, and then now what I have is an authentic rotational loaded, just through a bungee cord, device that allows me to play into authentic, proprioceptively appropriate strengthening of my hip. It's an awesome tool. So now I can think about, okay, hips, you drive. you drive. And of course I can set the situation up depending on the hip, depending on the direction that I want to go, depending if it's going to be I want to load through and it can help me go through my pattern, or if I'm golfing, I'm going to kind of let it pull me into it, and I can strengthen through that pattern. So again, know that it's assisted on the strategy that you want to play into it. But it's super awesome, very helpful when thinking about rotational hip strengthening that's directly appropriate to the action in front of you. But let's say you don't have that fancy tool. Well, I can go to single leg balance, right? I can still say, hip, you do the controlling, and let me think about just a rotational drive. And I'm using my pelvis to drive through my body. So I only have one leg connected to the ground. So basically this is the only hip that is working. This leg's just holding itself up against gravity, super simple. I can start to challenge my body through just that pattern. It's a simple step. Again, just one technique, but another way that we can do it is also think about just going to a plank. Now again, plank appropriate to the motion pattern that we want. So if I go to a plank and I just drive through my pelvis, I can still get the drive, the action, the pulse to help position myself to think about the authentic way that these muscles fire, put it under load, and then start to drive through it. So again, techniques are limitless, but it's a thought process that I want you to be sparked about. Like, okay, I see where this is going. I can see how I can start to problem solve for this. Now, the last way to think about this one from the most common ways is the ankle. Now, even though this is less likely from an elbow tendonitis to come from the ankle, it is still a possibility that I want you to take into consideration. So what happens? Well, let's say I'm doing a tennis serve, or I'm doing a tennis backhand, or a reach pattern to this way. Well, let's go to my left side. Well, what's happening at my left foot? Well, I'm actually going through relative supination. What's happening at supination? Well, there's three distinct different patterns of supination, but essentially it's just the rolling of the body that goes into it. Now, what if my talus and calcaneal bones can't play that game? Well, if I can't play that game, then I'm not going to load appropriately through that foot, which means that the lateral calf that feeds into my hamstring, that feeds into my glutes, that feeds into my right thoracic spine, to my latissimus dorsi, that feeds into the posterior muscles of my shoulder blade, that feed into my tricep, can't get the appropriate motion pattern. There's a leak in the system. There's a player not playing the game. So after thousands and thousands of repetitions, there could be a breakdown because of not an effective player that is into that motion pattern. Now again, if I'm stance on two feet, the same thing can happen from my same side. I may not be able to get, enough pronation. Again, a lot of different angles happening in pronation, but essentially that pattern right there. So then it feeds into this side isn't strong enough, quote unquote, this side isn't mobile enough. And then the exact same thing plays into medial epicondylitis. It's just the reverse on how it plays. Again, less likely, but still follows the same path of chain reaction biomechanics, the kinesthetic chain. And then for all the muscles that get loaded to therefore unload to produce power. So again, how am I going to test if it's a strength issue? Again, sequencing through the ankles and feet is a way to think about that. When they're throwing, reaching, is it all upper body and hips? But are their feet just totally planted and still? Whether you can look at that is actually looking from someone from the back side and say, are their heels moving inside and outside? So if you zoom in on my heels there, you'll see that I'm actually getting heel motion sliding that direction and heel motion sliding that direction. Therefore, it's a very simple test. There's much deeper tests to go into, but that's just a basic way to think, like, are my ankles and feet playing the game? If they're not, more friends that you can bring into the party to help your body move more efficiently, more effectively, and essentially more athletically. So that's the simplest way to look at, is it a strength sequencing problem or is it a mobility problem? So if those ankles are not moving the way they want to, what am I going to do about that? Well, what's the soft tissue that connects directly to it? Well, again, from a soft tissue perspective, we can go in and start to think about, okay, well, if I want more essentially supination, I want more lateral calf to be lengthened. So I'm going to kind of toe open and get much more lateral calf. Well, if I want more pronation, that's essentially going to be much more from the medial calf. Even though the whole calf plays the game, it's going to be essentially more hyper-focused on testing are those areas appropriately moving. But it may not just be the ankle. It could be the actual plantar fascia of the foot. So taking my shoe off, right, having a port, I can make sure that whole plantar fascia just has the hydration, has the capacity to move through those mid-tarsals and through those tarsals to make sure that everything's smooth and working well. So again, how to femoral is in a different video, but again, allows you to think about it from that perspective. What about from a stretching perspective? Well, because our joints are in much more of a dorsiflex position at the ankle, right? The typical calf stretch is not going to get it, which is the leg behind you with a knee extended. I want to stretch out my calf from a knee flexed position, which gets much more of the soleus than the gastroc. So from there, I can hold on, get support, and I can start to drive through my pronation and supination, even through my adduction and abduction as I drive my body in the frontal plane and the transverse plane. Again, we want to think about appropriate, proprioceptively authentic patterns of what we're trying to actually create at our foot. And even after just showing that example, my right side's actually feeling much more opened up than my left side. Interesting how quick it can start to make a change if being appropriate. Now from there, as I want to think about, okay, how can I use maybe slants and wedges, right? So like on our true stretches here, like we have a slant that takes me more into heel eversion and more into heel inversion. So I can actually start to position myself to stretch and to create more mobility. If you do have wedges around your facility, even a 2x4, right? Even a yoga mat rolled up, you can start to position it to help create more mobility by pre-positioning and changing the environment you're standing on to have that mobility as I'm driving through different planes of motion to create the lengthening and essentially the freedom of motion that your ankles need to create the full kinesthetic chain. What about from an exercise standpoint? Well, from a very specialized piece of equipment, this is not just a balance board, it's called a BAPS board, where it follows more authentic ankle biomechanics because the ball's not on the direct center, it actually follows much more of an oblong shape. Again, a BAPS board is what's called, I can practice more authentic patterns, more frontal plane patterns, than of course the important all around. Now in this drill, you want to make sure that they're not driving through their knee. The knee can stay relatively stable as it moves through the ankle. And as it moves through the ankle, you're going to get much more, again, relative strengthening than if someone starts to cheat their way through it. Again, stealing from just no tools, no necessarily just good old-fashioned chain reaction biomechanics, you can stand on a single leg and actually drive this same side knee or the opposite foot to create the chain into the other leg to create more ankle motion. Yes, it's the same drill that helped me with the hip, but again, a lot of drills do a lot of things. Again, we're thinking about it, how much can we create rotation at the ankle joint and lateral motion, which is the primary two players of essentially pronation and supination. All right, so hopefully you found some or all this helpful. If not, let me know in the comments so I can provide either more clarity or context. I want to take a quick second to remind you that these are just a few of the approaches you can take. If you want to get into addressing people's movement dysfunctional pain, you have to take an investigative approach. You have to be able to critically think, experiment, and see what and why or what is and what isn't working, because every single person has their own individual understanding of how they move, and therefore their body follows that same pattern. So each person is different. So it's my goal to help to try to equip you with the principles and strategies that will help you build these critical thinking and problem-solving skills so you can understand, again, how to think and not just what to think. So if you want to build onto these skills and work with me and my team, click on the link in the description below to check out the multidimensional movement coaching program. Lastly, if you enjoy this video and want us to keep putting videos out just like this, please like and subscribe, and even turn on the notification bell. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, cheers.